This is the 12th presentation, and we're going to take a look at the seed of the star system civilization in Pasadena on Catalina is the Planetary Society, founded by Carl Sagan a long time ago, and has a reach around the world in its membership, and recently put out a roadmap for the future of space travel. For the foreseeable future, the overall objective was to get a manned mission to Mars. This is all right for a planetary society, but a society is the integral thought structure in action, in a form of a culture. And so going to Mars as a manned mission, as the principal objective for a planetary society, is all right in terms of the past and of the current slide in the future, in the present, with a future based on those perimeters. We're going to expand on that more than a billion-fold today. Our basic quality of our lives is a reflection not only of our mind, but of an expansion of it into our visionary dimension, into our differentialness. And that differential consciousness as a field of vision has a flow within it. In the field of nature, the flow is experience. All existentials will have an experiential, time-bound minerals, metals, plants, fungi, animals, ourselves. For ourselves, the flow of experience is a mythic horizon which includes language and includes images, it includes feeling tones. And a planetary society looking forward to sending a manned mission to Mars is all right within that parenthetical framework. The field of consciousness is infinite. It does not have a mythic horizon. Instead, it has a historical horizon. And the historical horizon is kaleidoscopic. It doesn't just have a mythos flow of beginning, middle, and end, so that one then has a thread to follow. One can tell a story in however many variants of that journey, of that thread, of that flow of experience with the language and feelings and images. History is kaleidoscopic because it is differential and not integral. It doesn't come to a thread, it opens the spool so that there is a primordial difference. In the nature cycle, the symmetry is bilateral from existentials complete through ideation in the mind. That bilateral is not just male, female, left, right. It is the basic polarity by which existential things and existential actions are cinched into their stability with the recognition and the proviso that the stability is iterative, it's vibrational. So that one of the phrases used a generation ago for such a situation is vibronic coupling. But when you bring the ecology of the dimensions of consciousness into play, you move from a bilateral symmetry to a radial symmetry. And the simplest way that ancient wisdom characteristically around the planet came to express this was through the symbol of a flower. The lotus, or the rose, the orchid, or any number of floral symbols that would come to bear. A radial symmetry is like a five-pointed star. Think of the Hermetic star where you take a single line and you make a star. A radial symmetry is the shape and evolution that flowers take. If you have a bilateral symmetry, you can have leaves with the structure of leaves. But if you do a special folding, like an origami on leaves, and you have that kind of complexity built into the RNA and into the arrangement of the DNA with the transposons very, very active over a long time, those origamically folded leaves will begin to make a whorl, W-H-O-R-L, and that whorl will have a radial symmetry, and out of that comes literally flowers. When flowers appear, one has, for the very first time, an indication that there is a visionary field that is beginning to inform by transform, so that the lines of evolution are no longer just lines of evolution, but they begin now to branch out in a characteristic shape, and it's a tree. So if there's such a thing as a tree of life, because the bilateral symmetry has opened itself up to a radiative symmetry, and the branching of the tree will be complemented by the branching of the roots. So that the tree of life, of evolution, of species, is actually tree-like, and does not just have a bilateral distributed structure. Computing, which so far has been rather interestingly limited to a bilateral symmetry of ones and zeros, has begun to reach a threshold where IBM is running ads now about building a petaflop computer, 1 trillion bits, which means, in their ad, they say it means 50,000 computations per second for every human being on the planet is a petaflop computer. It begins to approach then the kind of incredibility of making an appearance which is in its essential understanding a mythic image base knit together by a mental structure, so that however realistic-like it is not real. It is an appearance that becomes extremely sophisticated, and all natural cycle qualities of being polarized iteratively are essentially appearances and not the limit of the real. The real is achieved by bringing the entire integral cycle of the field of nature all the way through to the structure of symbolic thought into a play, into a complementarity with the entire ecology, another 4 dimensions of consciousness. For us, we reached a threshold right after World War II in 1945, where we had just finished the Manhattan Project of making an atomic bomb that was rushed through at Los Alamos in just a couple of years' time, and the end of the war in Europe that came that autumn. Our American troops and the Russian troops descended immediately upon the Peenemünde rocket bases on the Baltic Ocean, where the German V-2 rockets were being assembled, and the United States came away toting their share of the V-2s with about 25 completed rockets and enough spare parts and unfinished ones to make a total of about 75 V-2s. They were all taken to White Sands Proving Grounds, exactly at the same place where the Trinity test site for the atomic bomb was. This was by December of 1945, and by January of 1946, the United States was already preparing sophistications built onto the V-2 because they had brought the bulk of the scientists, the rocket scientists, Wernher von Braun and a number of his colleagues. Within a couple of years, the United States was able to put a 2-stage rocket together that would exceed the capacity of the V-2 by another order. The highest that the V-2s ever went was about 100 miles. The highest of the first 2-stage rocket developed by the Naval Research Laboratory. Their original rocket was called an Araby. After that, they came up with a WAC Corporal, a WAC Corporal rocket, a 2-stage. They put the WAC Corporal onto a V-2, and by early 1949 achieved an altitude of over 300 miles, higher than the International Space Station. And this was more than 50 years ago. That entire program was put into a top secret program called the MX-775 under the direct supervision of the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. James V. Forrestal was the first Secretary of Defense. Before then, we had Secretaries of War. Forrestal put on the farthest back burner the United States rocket program, so that it took the shock of the Russians' success with Sputnik some 8 years later to shock them to realize that they had pulled quite a bit ahead of our program. The Russian program under Korolev was able to assemble a vision where they called those human beings who went into those rockets to go up, not just instruments, but human beings, cosmonauts. They're going to be the explorers of the cosmos. But that capacity also reached a plateau, and there has never been a Russian that has ever gone to the moon. the best that they could do and have done is to go into low Earth orbit. The United States has also, since 1972, put a plateau into place so that there have been no manned expeditions to the moon for all that while. It's going on almost 30 years now. More than that, 37 years, almost 40 years. What I'm going to lay out before you is the vision of a star system civilization. When life has a threshold where it enters into a fertile creative jump, as in a new species or in a refinement of species in our case, there are always scalars that seem to operate. And one of the scalars for our kind is a population of 10 human beings. So that the basic outpost cell would be 10 people, and to maintain the initial polarity, 5 men and 5 women, not necessarily paired together in 5 couples, but in that kind of equilibrium. Their main responsibility in an outpost starting to expand civilization to a star system wide would be science. But the sciences need to have, because of the differential ecology, they need to have art as well as science as forms that are operative and are existentially real, but not in a even proportion. The classic proportion in wisdom was always 10%, 1 in 10. Tithing. One makes a tithe of making a gift of the first fruits, and the 10 human beings who would be in each outpost would also have an individual who would be like an artist in residence. Those 10, 2 of which would need to be in care of health and nutrition. Doctors, surgeons, cooks, gardeners, all in one. And the reason for pairing is that when you're out in outposts in the star system, you always have to have a backup. There always has to be someone who can come in immediately, and not just to keep the continuity, but to keep the shape of the radial symmetry whole and fresh. The artist in residence would not be a part of the assigned structure of health and nutrition pair, or a tech and mech pair, handling all the mechanics, all of the technology, and the 6 others who would be the scientists for each of the outposts. And that these outposts would largely be assigned in groups of 3. So that if you went to a moon, or you went to a object in the Kuiper belt large enough to sustain communities, you would have 3 outposts, which would make about 30 people, plus the 3 artists in residence would make a population of about 33, as a basic kind of a structure for establishing a place where the human stellar civilization could count on being able to get to be fed, to be refueled, to make some kind of a special contact. And the ancient way in which a cycle of natural information and integral was based was always on a 3-year cycle. The most stringent 3-year cycle was called the lectionary cycle, and it was developed after the Jews came back from the exile. None of them understood their heritage at all, because they had been for 3 generations in the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And so it was set up that every male who had passed puberty, had had his bar mitzvah, was required each Sabbath to hear a part of the Torah read out loud, and it took 3 years of Sabbaths in order to read the entire Torah out loud. And so that lectionary cycle, you'll find it in the Gospel according to John. He writes his structure so that one could literally read a section every Sunday for 3 years, and you would be able to have the 21 chapters, 7 chapters per year. There is a way to understand this and get that. So the posting would be for a 3-year cycle, but because many of these destinations are quite far out, literally, there would need to be a 1-year travel time allowance and a 1-year travel return allowance, so that the total mission would be about 5 years. And to prepare men and women for this also takes a series of preparations of about 6 years to mature them from, say, the age of 18 to the age of 24. They would be ready then to go out on assignment, and the 5 years of 1 year travel, 3 years posting, 1 year coming back would be followed by a sequence of a couple of years of debriefing, not simply to debrief to structures of authority, but to refine the teaching of the next group going out. So that constantly you would have a refreshing ecology of experience and history, of the art and science, of the visionary qualities of humanity, which are going to change radically, rather radically. More radical than radical. The word I use is a recalibration. Melville in Moby Dick said there's all the difference in the world between paying and being paid. Those who pay for journeys on the sea do not really get the sea like someone who is being paid to be the runners of the ship, the sailors. And that once you get into being a part of the crew, rather than being a part of the load, you change. You develop not only sea legs, but you develop an oceanic sense. Melville also says, many a young man getting his first visionary glimpse of belonging on the ocean will be posted at the top of the highest sail as a lookout for whales. And he will experience at some time crossing the threshold where the weave of the ship on the velvet ocean pulse and his visionary eye going out beyond the horizons into the infinite sky and into the horizon that curves around the world of the ocean, he will suddenly be in danger of missing the fact that you should stay in your crow's nest and not plunge overboard, because it's a long way down, and when you hit the water, you usually don't survive. He closed it by saying, what that young man experiences is God's foot on the treadle of the rhythms of life. That one going out into the star system will come into an expanded, more mature sense of what the rhythms of life are like. To stop by hoping just to get to Mars one misses the life on Europa in the oceans, the life on Ganymede in the oceans, the life forms on Enceladus orbiting Saturn, the peculiar life forms on Titan, the incredible life forms that may be on Triton going around Neptune, and many of the Kuiper Belt objects. Here's how it would break down. There would be 4 outposts on Mercury, one at each of the poles, and one on either side of the equator, where you would have a way of understanding the research of Mercury, which begins our star system. The messenger going to Mercury has made a couple of reconnaissances, and its orbit is going to be stable by 2011. And messenger will be able to give us the kind of detail that the Mars orbiters have given us of Mars. At the very same time, the Dawn probe will go into the asteroid belt and encounter the second largest asteroid, Vesta, in 2011. And then we'll go through the asteroid belt and encounter in 2015 the largest asteroid, Ceres, the only one that has a spherical shape, about 500 miles in diameter. And at the same time that Dawn gets to Ceres, New Horizons will get to Pluto and its large moon Charon. So that by 2015, we will have gone from Mercury to the middle of the star system to the farthest dwarf planet, Pluto, and its very large moon, Charon. Charon's about 1/3 the size of Pluto. And they are the first of the Kuiper Belt objects, some of which are larger than Pluto, like Eris is about 20% larger than Pluto, but almost 100 astronomical units away. Jupiter is about 5 astronomical units for us, so that Eris is 20 times as far as Jupiter. And we're still in our star system. Here's how it would break down. 4 outpost groups. That would be a total of 40 people plus the 4 artists in residence, about 44 people. And because they have a 3-year stint, you don't want to have a complete turnover every year, and so you break it in half, that every year and a half the population changes. And over a 3-year period, you would have had a complete change. Now, to run populations of people, you would have to have a fleet manned by crews able to go to all of the destinations in the star system, so that you would need a quite capacious ship, because some of these places are going to have a lot of people. And the size that recommends itself is about a crew of 50 to run the spaceships, very large concerns, that could support a population of up to several hundreds of people for at least a year's time. And the crew also then is like an emergency pool in case of deaths or tragedies that they could fill in and keep the continuity of the outposts. And just as with the outposts, you would have for every 10 persons an artist in residence. So with a crew of 50, you would have 5 artists in residence on each ship for each voyage going out. 4 outposts on Mercury. Venus is impossible to land on and stay, and so you would have 2 orbital outposts. You would have about 6 here, and the name for this planet then would become Terra, not Earth. Earth is a troglodyte name for this beautiful planet. It's Terra. One of the books that came out a couple of years ago on the 5 kingdoms, an illustrated guide to the phyla of life on Earth, had this beautiful illustration of all 5 kingdoms of life holding Terra as a special jewel. This illustration was done by Dorian Sagan, who was the first son of Carl Sagan. And his mother was the first wife of Carl Sagan, Lynn Margulies, who at the time when she wrote this was at Boston University with Carlene Schwartz, who was at a university in Boston as well, Boston College, I believe. The foreword to the book was done by Stephen Jay Gould, who was at Harvard in the Boston area. Terra would have 6 outposts and 6 artists in residence then to give us a metronome of how these outposts are working in terms of this as being a planet. The first time that anyone ever wrote about the Earth as a planet was Gerard Kuiper. He was at the University of Chicago at the time. And he did a 4-volume set called The Solar System. And the first volume was on the sun. The second, Earth as a planet. Not to think of it as a globe. The thought of the Earth as a globe is about 500 years out of date. The first person to be able to do the math and make the instruments so that one could globally navigate was John Dee. And he wrote his book in 1475. It was about a generation later that Shakespeare built the Globe Theatre in London because rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never will be slaves. It isn't global. It's a planet. And so by setting up 6 outposts, so you would have 6 times 10, you would have 60 people plus 6 artists in residence, so that the arts and sciences would keep their 10-to-1 proportion. And the artists are always those who will have no assignments. They will be free to roam. They will be like jokers in the deck. They will have a wild card status that they can go where they choose to go and do what they choose to do. They could participate for a while here or there. They could stand out and not participate at all for a while. But in these kinds of situations, what is going to come up are children. And because it's only a 3-year stint with a year travel one way there, most of these will be infants. So there's a quality of an artist in residence helping to keep the scalar of the way in which a life has an enormous creative range and spectrum. The moon will no longer be called the moon, but Luna, because there'll be many moons. There'll be outposts on more than a dozen moons. Our Luna will have about 10 outposts because it has a complexity that's immediately relatable to Terra as a planet. We're actually a double planet. The moon is large enough, and its relationship to us, if you took all of the land mass of the Earth, it would be less than the land mass of the moon because there are no oceans on the moon. So you're talking about doubling the size of the geography of human beings just by going to the moon and staying. And not only staying, but staying in a pointed way so that you would have populations of people, 5 men and 5 women for each outpost, plus an artist in residence. The qualities of having a number of these, so that on the moon with 10, you would have 100 plus 10, you'd have 110 people. And it isn't the top level limit of how many people will be at these various destinations throughout the star system, but it will be the fundamental spinal column. It'll be the skeletal structure of a star system civilization. Mars will have 8, 1 on each of the small moons, which are captured asteroids, Phobos and Deimos, and 6 on the surface. The great fascination with Mars goes all the way back to the discovery by an Italian astronomer, Schiaparelli, of canals on Mars. And the great astronomer who pursued that was Percival Lowell, whose sister was the great early 20th century American poet Amy Lowell. And Percy Lowell, in fact, was an Oriental specialist. He spoke Japanese like Japanese. He spoke Korean like Koreans. And he was the one that set up the first Korean business contacts with the United States. He was the unofficial ambassador who did that. Then he got fascinated with Mars and its canals, and he took his great fortune and went to Flagstaff, Arizona, and built the Lowell Observatory. So the fascination with Mars is like a bit of a red herring, lovable and traditional, but the real juice begins when one goes out beyond the asteroid belt. Ceres is large enough to have 3 outposts, but the next 3 major asteroids, Vesta, Pallas, and Juno, would be covered by a single outpost. So you would have 11 people on each of those. On Ceres, you would have 33. When you get to Jupiter, Jupiter is a way station for us. It would have about 18 outposts centered on the 4 Galilean moons. Io is a dangerous place, no more than 3 outposts there. Callisto is a rather forbidding moon, though it's very large. You would have 3 there. But Ganymede and Europa would have 6 each, because each of them has an ocean that most certainly supports life and life forms. And besides that, it would give you a population at Jupiter beginning to look out to very large steps forward. From Earth to Jupiter, the next step to Saturn is as far as all of that. And the next step to Uranus is as far as all of that. And the next step to Neptune is as far as all of that. And then you get to the Kuiper Belt, where it opens up and the differential distances become rather staggering. We're going to take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll resume the outline of the setting up of a stellar civilization. And all of this will be done by 2100 in this century, by the end of it. Let's take a break. Let's come back to Jupiter. Jupiter has 4 very large moons, 2 of which have massive oceans underneath a fairly thin crust. Ganymede is the largest moon in the star system, and has a diameter that's almost half that of our planet, so that we're looking at very substantial bodies. By having outposts of scientific personnel of 10 and an artist in residence for each one, and then positioning numbers of these outposts around a star system body, is not just to do the research, to do a reconnaissance, but to undergo a continuous iteration of population of men and women who will be able to get their sea legs, their space legs, their space vision because the horizon is quite daunting for those who are earthbound. It's the same with classic, shamanistic, or mystic qualities of human beings. One of the most beautiful paired volume sets of inquiry on this was done in the 1940s by Mircea Eliade. He wrote the classic book on shamanism and the classic book on yoga. Shamanism is the natural cycle being transcended. The yoga is the conscious ecology being initiated. And so they come together, and the two volumes, if they are read together as a pair, are able to convey the penetration through this threshold, because it is not a wall, it's a membrane. And the membrane of the shamanic transcendence is exactly the membrane of the conscious dimension realization. And it is a shock for someone who has never approached this. Usually the premonition of a shamanic journey will be a dire illness. Ill for years. So that one would have been put outside of the tribe, outside of the village, outside of the world, that the current of experience folds in to its integral, outside of the ability to put things together into some kind of symbolic order and structure. And as Joseph Campbell once said, talking to someone who had gone through this experience as a boy, he said, I was left out there to die. And I did. I died over and over again until I didn't die anymore. And then I was able to return different. And the different is the difference between being in an integral cycle and coming to the penetration through to a differential ecology. The Paleolithic shaman who would make the other shore became the Paleolithic artist. The ability to make a work of art is not an existential act. It's not a mental design. It is a spiritual radiance. And that radial symmetry that comes out now has different kinds of forms, not just different kinds in an integral list of kinds, but a differential quality where the first two phases of consciousness will work transformations on the natural cycle. But the next two phases will work distillations on not only the natural cycle, but on the first two transformational phases. Vision and art can transform everything from nature to symbol. But the next two dimensions of history and science distill all six of those previous, so that what one comes out with by the time that one has entered into science, not science as a mental subject. It is not a discipline. The sciences are not disciplines. That is grade school misunderstanding. This is an eighth-dimensional quality where the ecology of vision, that by science the vision now is understood in a distillation to be a theory. The Greek word theoria does not just mean a theory to prove. Theoria in Greek means a contemplative field of realization that is unlimited. What is limited in that field is the symbolic structure, for the first time recognized to have a limited shape. It is useful, but it has a limited shape, and therefore a symbolic system is a tool. It is not the be-all concept that is like the highest that one can go. This is egotistical. It's also illusional, and to believe it is to be immersed in delusion, truly samsara. Waking up from that wakes one into the larger dimensions that have their ecology of expansion and complexification. But the distillation is cued in by the art of the art forms, by the artist as a person who now prismatically has done all the transforming so that the pragmatic action of ritual and the symbolic structure of thought are now seen as related within a tool. That the integral cycle itself, large as it is, seemingly complete as it always was suspected to be, is actually a tool for a starting place, and the same in terms of our planet. The planet is not the world. It is a world. The earth is not the world. It is a place that is limited. And when you get to Mars, it looks like a blue star. It doesn't look like the Earth anymore. And so to call it Earth is not only a misnomer, but even by the time you get to Mars, it's a star. It is a planet very much like Jupiter from Mars is a star, a rather brighter star than Earth. From Mars, Jupiter looks even brighter sometimes than Venus does from our planet. What stellar civilization is doing is acclimating our species, who have been wise for a very long time. Peking man, who was Homo erectus, discovered fire 500,000 years ago. We have been around a long time. 2 million years ago, Homo erectus was so capable physiologically and organizing hunting that they spread throughout the entire African Eurasian landmass more than 2 million years ago already. And there were species of hominids before them. We have been around a long time. We live in a threshold where we are discovering a star system terrain in which to be real, so that the ecology of our consciousness, both through the transformation and through the distillation, is going to jump many orders beyond where it has been. The visionary presage of this, the prophetic generations before this, began to take a very definite shape in the 1890s. the figure who is most capable of sustaining the early half century of that visionary endeavor was H.G. Wells. The Time Machine came out in 1895. The Island of Dr. Moreau came out in 1896. And every year after that was an increase, another volume that was incredible. The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, When the Sleeper Wakes. And Wells's first Men in the Moon came out in 1901, and it greeted the 20th century with a man who for 6 years had already been at the vanguard of being a prophet for the new stellar civilization. The covers of the first Men in the Moon are varied. And this was published 108 years ago. As soon as Wells got to the First World War, 1914, he stopped writing science fiction visionary novels, and he began to look at the crumple of the social, cultural, so-called personality and individualism. In the tug of war of love, of romance, of social complications, and at the same time began to write nonfiction books. The first was called Anticipations. The last was called, when he died in 1946, his final book was called Mind at the End of Its Tether. In between, he wrote the outline of history in 2 massive volumes with 1,000 illustrations to try to do the kind of spade work and field work that everyone who was alert in that prophetic visionary time was trying to deal with, and Wells did as well as almost anyone. My work here has its origins about the time that Wells passed on. My first book that has my signature in is from 1945, Flash Gordon and the Red Sword Invaders. So I've been at this for 64 years, almost 2/3 of a century myself. What I'm laying before us is the seed of a star system civilization that will be done in the next 90 years. Jupiter with 18 outposts, meaning that there would be also 18 artists in residence. So you would have 198 people in the Jupiter system, but every year and a half of those would be replaced, that's another 100, by a crew that's over 50, so that you would end up with more than 350 people every year and a half in the Jupiter system by itself, which is a sizable population of talented men and women who are concerted yogically and shamanically at the same time together. Because going out not just into space, but going out into an interplanetary space where one goes out far enough that there are no planets to be seen for most of the time, but only stars. It is an extraordinary experience. We talked last week in the presentation about being in a cave where it is 100% pitch black. And if you light a single match, like a kitchen match, it flares as if it were a highway flare. And what is peculiar is that it radiatively illuminates in such a way that you can perceive the fading of the effect of the light on into the darkness, so that the darkness is there, but one acquires a peculiar quality, not of perception, but of visioning. One can see that the darkness is not a darkness, but is an infinity. When one goes into the Paleolithic caves, none of those caves are where daylight can be seen. They were in total darkness. The little hand-size lights that they had, made out of clay, with animal fat and a hole, and a little bit of tendon, like a wick, and just lighting that way, one could make, by 20,000 years ago, a Lascaux. We are going to make interplanetary Lascaux that stretches. Saturn is 1 billion miles away, and it's only the beginning. Eris, which has its own moon, Diasomia, is 100 astronomical units away. That's 100 times 100 million miles. When you get to those kinds of dimensions, men and women in the latter part of this century will begin to undergo the kind of sea change that a shamanic experience and a yogic experience together produced classically in wisdom traditions, but it will be populations of people who are doing this as the scalar of their lives. They will have children who will grow up never having known the limitations of the past. And so for them, the past will become not something that one retroly seeks, but a new past that one looks to transform and distill continuously, to update all the time. Even now, the younger people who have grown up since 1985, when computers first really began to come in and little grade school kids were pooled together to teach them how to work computers. Now the petaflop computers coming from IBM will be able to make them look like little toys. The generation that is born now, these young boys and girls that are coming in, they will inhabit the star system probably as far out to Jupiter by the 2070s. And very rapidly after that, because of new ways of not just propulsion, but of dimensional attraction, it will be a lot faster to be able to develop. Saturn with 12 outposts, so that there would be 10 times 12, 120 people, plus 12 artists and residents, 132 people. Every year and a half, you would have half of them, about 66, 67 people, plus the shuttle ship, the cruise ship coming with 55 people, so that you would have around Saturn for every year and a half a get-together with, let's see, I worked it out here so that it would be over 250 people. So that these holiday visits of the time it would take to come and pick up the half of the people to go on the return and to bring a new half of the people to take on their outpost, these would be like a month of holiday visit that would become the hoedown of sharing with the possibilities that are by this time going to be truly kaleidoscopic. We think that we have a complexity of outlook. Theirs will exceed ours by more than 1,000 times easily. But the preparation for that cannot be only on the level of developing in a science fiction or in a technology or in a science, but to be able to go back and give oneself the calibration, layering of the transforms and the distillations that we are already acquainted with in our heritage. For this, I developed the learning civilization over 42 years of a 2-year cycle, the first year of which is a cycle, the second year of which is a transforming ecology. And that by getting used to that kind of rhythm, that kind of a complex rhythm, the development of insight is eventually asymptotic. If you develop in such a way, let's use an old-fashioned IQ, if you increase your IQ 10%, each time you do a year, it doesn't take very many years before you've doubled your IQ. And it doesn't take even half that to double that again. People used to estimate that Goethe had one of the highest IQs on the planet at close to 180, 190. It will become a norm about 2 generations from now. Not just a generation of genius, but a population able to expand their genius so that it is not chartable. It is not aliens who are really superior. It is our species in the future that is prophetically seen now, as Wells in the 1890s saw where we are today. We're seeing another 110 years in the future. What happens in this is that by the time you get out to Uranus, you get out to a quality where Uranus is twice as far from Jupiter as Jupiter is from us. And it has there would be 8. There are 5 major moons plus one called Puck. The names of the moons are all from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Oberon, Titania, Ariel, Umbriel is not, Miranda is, Puck is. There is a series of rings, and the closest ring, the E ring, to the major one for Uranus, has 2 little moons, Cordelia and Ophelia, that shepherd this ring. And they will be populated also because it's a microscope chance to see how ring structures generate themselves. The major E ring of Uranus is quite compact. The Saturn rings are really quite large. They're enormous. It will take quite a different kind of understanding to see the patterns that are in the Saturnian rings. So there are 8 at Uranus. Neptune will have 6, and 3 of those will be on the large moon Triton, which actually is not a satellite of Neptune naturally, but is a captured object. It's very large from out in the Kuiper Belt region, brought in about the same kind of elliptical orbits that Pluto and its moon Charon have. Occasionally Pluto and Charon are within the orbit of Neptune, but most of the time they're outside. And the Kuiper Belt objects, there are at least 10 that recommend themselves already by 2009. Pluto and Charon together. Eris, which is the farthest out, it's not technically in the Kuiper Belt, but it is an extension called the scattered disk. It also has a little moon, Dicylmia. It's a couple of 100 miles in diameter. But Eris is a very, very large object, quite a bit larger than Pluto. The other objects that have been discovered have been given creator god names like Makemake from Hawaii, Haumea, Sedna from the Inuit people, the Eskimos, Orcus, Kwarar from the Polynesian South Pacific, and Varuna from India, so that one has, by 2100, a population of human beings undergoing transformations and distillations so incredibly compact and complexified that after even just a 3-year stint, a couple of iterations of that, of coming back and not just reporting, but by presenting themselves in the distillated, transformed presence, we will see it would take probably no more than about 8 or 9 iterations like that to make a major difference in a population. While all of this could be staffed by maybe 20,000 persons with, say, another 60,000 as support, 80,000 people doesn't sound like much for a planet that will have soon 8-9 billion people on it. But as soon as there is a pilot light, there is an ignition acceleration. And every generation after that will have an expansion, which is a truly fairy tale. Our great-grandchildren will be as different from us as we are from medieval villagers. But they need our preparation of vision. They need our prism of person. And they need our kaleidoscopic consciousness of the freedom of history to be able to be at home on the interstellar frontier. Because far out as it sounds from what we have presented, it only gets us about halfway to the interstellar frontier. The Oort cloud is 50,000 astronomical units away. It's still in our star system. If you were to take the entirety of the star system in its farthest threshold shock wave in the interstellar medium, it would be about a light year. As far as light travels an entire year, once we have nourished this and seeded this, by about 2200, there will be Homo sapiens stellaris in majority of human beings. Most human beings who are there for us to encounter now are Homo sapiens sapiens, occasionally some still Homo sapiens, some still from the early Paleolithic, before the transforms of art and vision, who become astounded that there are such things as visionary experiences, who read books to get ideas about shamanism, who do exercises to get into yoga. There is all the difference in the world between a Hatha yoga and a Raja yoga. This is a Maharaja yoga. This is something that the scalar has not even been touched when you get to a petaflop computer scale. We're going to take a look next week at the first wife of Carl Sagan. She, Lynn Margulis, in writing The Symbiotic Planet, she wrote, "My theory of the symbiogenetic origin of plant, animal, and other cells with nuclei employs 4 provable postulates. All four involve symbiogenesis, incorporation, and body fusion by symbiosis. The theory precisely outlines the steps that must have occurred in the past. Cells, of course, are familiar units of structure in mosses, ferns, all other plants. And she goes on to talk about all of the other kingdoms. The lead blurb on the jacket: although Charles Darwin's theory of evolution laid the foundations of modern biology, it did not tell the whole story. Most remarkably, the origin of species said very little about, of all things, the origins of species. Darwin and his modern successors have shown very convincingly how inherited variations are naturally selected, but they leave unanswered how variant organisms come to be in the first place. And for that, we need to go to Stephen Jay Gould next week for a little bit of his final book. He died prematurely of health complications. The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. Not an evolutionary theory, but structuring the evolution of that theory in terms of a historical kaleidoscopic consciousness, so that what emerges is not an idea of evolution, but the science of understanding the transform and the distillation of the idea of evolution. This is truly a recalibration. Gould, being one of the incredible figures in New York City later in his life, was also a great baseball fan and wrote a number of articles on baseball teams because he said it was one of those sports that had an indefinite complexity of things that could go wrong and things that could be not only just right, but superstar. That it was one of those strange human creations where anyone who really played the game realized it's not a game. It's a life and has the complexities of reality that emerge, so that one doesn't follow the score so much, but one rhythms to be in yourself, not subsumed by the game. Paul Newman, who became one of the really great race drivers, said it was his discovery that he could be truly at home in himself at top speed because he wasn't in the race. He wasn't in the car. He was a part of the road. More next week.